So after a few preliminaries, we will revisit the fundamental distinction between phonography and morphography in writing systems, drawing upon cases from three different areas. 1, transitions from morphograms to phonograms and vice versa. 2, semantic motivations in the choice of phonograms, as well as 3, gray areas in which given graphs are indeterminable as to their typological status. And you won't be surprised to hear that we will end this talk with some conclusions. So first things first, the preliminaries. As you all know, there are many proposals out there as to the classification of writing systems. But in tree-like models and matrix-like models alike, so-called glottographic writing is commonly divided into phonography on the one hand and something else on the other that goes by several names, usually logography or increasingly morphography. But let me stress this right away that we do not take issues with these two basic types in the talk. The typological distinctions just mentioned is applied to different levels, such as to the level of writing systems as a whole, that is phonographic versus morphographic writing systems, but also to the level of individual graphs or strings of graphs within a given system, that is phonograms versus morphograms. So the two categories understood here and elsewhere, but not necessarily universally so, are chiefly on the level of mapping. That is, the mapping of one or more graphs onto one or more phonemes or morphemes in phonography and morphography respectively. When we speak of morphemes and morphography, this naturally involves the level of phonology too, as every morpheme necessarily has a phonological representation. This understanding is oftentimes absent in other conceptualizations of what logography or morphography is. It is important to note, however, that the terms logography or morphography are also at times applied to what might be termed the level of knowledge required in reading or in writing something. So simply put, the issue at hand here is as follows. Is it possible to get from pronunciation to spelling and vice versa by simple mapping rules? Or do we need morpheme-specific knowledge? It is in this sense that the contemporary English writing system is sometimes called partly logographic or pseudo-logographic or similar terms. So let's start with our first of the three main sections touching upon cases of typological transitions. Most of the issues in this section are well known, so it serves more as a reminder than anything else. As we all know from the history of writing, transitions from morphograms to phonograms are crucial for the development of full-fledged writing systems whenever a strong morphographic component is present from the outset. They likewise occur on a regular basis during the process of script transfer from one system to another. So in Chinese, both in the early history of the writing system, but also during its later course, morphograms were used phonographically to write near homophones. This was especially important for function words, so words denoting abstract concepts and so on. Such a phonographic use may or may not be taken to cancel the original morphographic value. Therefore, depending on one's interpretation, the second stage involved either the older morphographic use plus a new phonographic one, or only the latter. Either way, a transition from morphogram to phonogram has taken place. And as indicated in the title of this slide, this also works into the opposite direction, as eventually some phonographic uses of graphs were conventionalized as morphograms. So in the example below, a character originally writing the word for winnowing basket was first borrowed to write several near homophones, including a high-frequency function word, namely a third-person possessive pronoun. This usage was then conventionalized so that in the next step, the graph might be reanalyzed as a morphogram again. Probably the most interesting case of transitions from phonograms to morphograms is that of so-called Aramaic heterograms in Middle Iranian languages. Imagine spelling out the Latin word corpus to render the English word body in an English language text. But to give you an actual example from a Middle Iranian language, the Sogdian word for neck, body, for instance, can be found written either phonographically or morphographically. In the first case, given in green here, its Sogdian pronunciation is spelled out in the Aramaic-based Sogdian script. And in the second case, given in blue, it is written in the same script, but in a way that does not reflect its pronunciation in Sogdian at all, but rather the pronunciation of its translation equivalent in Aramaic. Such spellings are what is often referred to as heterograms in the literature. In Sogdian, we are thus clearly dealing with a morphogram on the level of mapping. But it goes back in Aramaic to a string of phonograms, which may at the same time, however, be taken as a morphogram on the level of knowledge, owing to the nature of the writing system as a consonantary. Transitions from phonograms to morphograms are also abundant when it comes to abbreviations. When abbreviations are formed within a writing system, we can describe the resulting forms as morphograms on the level of knowledge. So traces of phonography are still evident, but morpheme-specific knowledge is required to get from spelling to pronunciation. However, abbreviations often also feature non-phonographic elements. So for instance, the letter R in the abbreviation Mrs. makes perfect sense in a diachronic perspective, but doesn't correspond to any phoneme synchronically. And the same applies to the systematically employed iconic doubling of letters within abbreviations to represent plurals, for instance. Lastly, when abbreviations are borrowed from one writing system to another and eventually read out as the translation equivalent in the recipient language, such as the Latin-based e.g. in English pronounced as for instance, we have to treat this as a morphogram on the level of mapping, similar to the Sogdian case from the previous slide. The treatment of abbreviations borrowed from other languages as morphograms is maybe even more apparent in the case on the right. So here you can see a Christian text in Japanese dating from 1599, in which the Latin-based abbreviation for dies is treated as one graphic unit on par with the morphographically employed Chinese characters. And this brings us to section 2 on semantically motivated phonograms, for which Sven will take over.
So in writing systems featuring both phonograms and morphograms with largely overlapping inventories of signs, as for instance in Chinese and Japanese, phonograms are not necessarily alone chosen with regard to the best possible fit in terms of pronunciation. Instead, considerations of semantics play a significant role as well, not limited to, but particularly so for the phonographic representation of proper nouns. Such cases clearly depend on and would be unthinkable without the morphographic use of the same graphs in other contexts, but they must be distinguished from morphography as such. So let's have a look at the first set of examples from Old Japanese. In elaborate, playful modes of inscription, as seen in Old Japanese poetry, some phonograms are clearly semantically motivated. For instance, graphs that in other contexts are used as morphograms for certain words are also employed as phonograms to write certain portions of precisely these words. Thus, the two characters given here are well attested as morphograms for capiero, to return, and kusa, grass, respectively, but they also occur together with other phonograms to spell these words, in which case they represent only one syllable each, namely pie and sa, respectively. A comparison with the Middle Chinese sound values, abbreviated here as MC, shows that these are not very good phonetic matches, but arguably the semantic match made up for the discrepancy in sound. It is therefore hardly coincidental that these phonograms show a skewed distribution and never occur to write these syllables pie and sa in any other words. In other cases, the semantics do not match entirely, but instead special phonograms are used for allusions to related words, thus adding a layer of meaning. A case in point is the spelling for the word quopri, longing, given here, which makes use of phonograms implying something like alone and sad, And these phonograms are again virtually limited to writing the same word quadri over and over again in the corpus of old Japanese poetry. As already mentioned, semantic connotations deriving from the morphographic use of characters are especially commonly observed in the spellings of proper nouns. This is not limited to pre-modern times. For instance, ameliorative connotations are commonly met with in the phonographic portions of spellings of female personal names in contemporary Japan, such as Emiko, Kaiko, or Michiko, or many others, implying positive attributes such as blessed and beautiful, auspicious and eternal, or beautiful and intelligent, respectively. There are actually much fancier cases in this field and entire guidebooks, even not just for choosing a good name as such, but also a good written representation of that name, showing a keen awareness of the connotations involved. Situated time-wise somewhere in between the 8th century and today are transcriptions from Christian contexts from about 1600, such as the following for the name of Jesus Christ as used by Jesuit missionaries. The picture on the right-hand side, by the way, is a little bit for the Paris feeling of this talk, because the book shown there was actually published more than 400 years ago in Paris. Yeah, this is as much of Paris we can get today, at least for those of us who are not really, yeah, anywhere close to Paris. So, so coming back to the examples here, we see that first in Japan, Jesu is written in a way implying Lord of the world, Master, and Jesu Christo is likewise written in a way implying Lord of the world, teacher of noble reason, who brings us across or who rescues us. In China, the Jesuits came up with a different solution, but one that equally involves certain connotations, namely father and resurrect. The choice of phonograms in all these cases is clearly everything but coincidental. So far, we have only addressed cases involving neutral or positive semantics, but that's of course only part of the story. The Portuguese-based word Christian as a designation of the early Christians in Japan, for instance, is attested in various different spellings, such as the following. First, we have spellings that qualify as fairly neutral. The one given here is what you can still find in modern dictionaries, but you can also find it in the titles of scholarly publications and so on. If you wanted to show your disdain for Christianity, for instance, after the expulsion of Christian missionaries from the country in the early 17th century, there were other ways of transcribing the same word, choosing some phonograms implying, as in the example here, a demon or death. If, on the other hand, you were a missionary or convert yourself, you would opt for totally different spellings with positive connotations, similar to those we have seen for the name of Jesus Christ in the preceding slide, teacher of noble reason, and so on. So now for the third and last of the main sections of our talk, treating indeterminable cases. While it is common nowadays to address overall writing systems as being typologically mixed, featuring both phonography and morphography to some degree or another, it seems often to be taken for granted that specific graphs or strings of graphs can clearly be assigned either to the class of phonograms or to the class of morphograms. In fact, however, there are gray areas in which the typological status of a given graph, that is it phonographic or morphographic, is disputable, if not indeterminable. The existence of such gray areas may be largely irrelevant for the trained reader, but it often clashes with the approach of modern transcriptions, for instance, of Japanese texts, which usually imply clear-cut two-way distinctions, either in kana versus Chinese characters as phono and morphograms respectively, at least by and large, or also in romanization using, for instance, lowercase versus uppercase or small caps for phono and morphograms respectively. So in today's usage, there's a clear-cut visual distinction corresponding with a functional distinction most of the time. Thus, you can easily tell the difference between a kana writing the syllable or mora, mi, as a phonogram, and a Chinese character writing the verb mido, to see as a morphogram. In pre-modern times, however, mi was alternatively written as indicated on the slide, which etymographically speaking is simply the cursive form of the character we have just seen as being used as a morphogram for the verb to see. Thus, when we look at cursively written text, which was common both in manuscripts and woodblock prints up until the late 19th century, there's no visual distinction between phono and morphograms at times. Let's have a look at an actual example here from a 17th century print. The case in green offers no problem for the transcription, as the word for miso soup has nothing to do with the verb to see. The character in question is thus clearly a phonogram for the syllable mi, nothing more. But what about the case given in blue? Here the character is ambiguous, as it could either write the syllable mi as a phonogram, or it could likewise write a form of the verb mido as a morphogram. And in a modern transcription, you are forced to make a decision. But the functional distinction is not necessarily clear-cut in the original. Similar difficulties are also common in Old Japanese, as the same graphs were often used as phonograms and morphograms in different contexts without any visual distinction. Again, let's have a look at concrete examples, this time illustrated by snippets from a modern edition of a major Old Japanese text. In the example on the left, the marked character is transcribed as lowercase pa, suggesting a phonogram for pa, while in the example on the right, the same character is transcribed as uppercase pa, now suggesting a morphogram for what is often termed a topic marker, the particle pa. Note, however, that despite the difference in transcription, the glosses on both sides indicate that both occurrences of the same character are interpreted as rendering exactly the same morpheme. Of course, the point here is not to criticize the edition for being inconsistent. What's far more important here and more interesting is what has led to such inconsistency, namely the inherent ambiguity in the writing system. Both interpretations make sense in a way. It is likewise difficult to draw a dividing line between phonograms and morphograms in renderings for toponyms, such as those given below for Nara, Ise, and Noto. These make use of what used to be common phonograms, but they were earlier conventionalized as official spellings, many already in the 8th century. Back then, these characters used to write na, ra, I, se, no, to, and so on were standard phonograms, so that syllables such as na, ra, and so on in any word could be written using these graphs. So how should they be classified here in these toponym spellings? Are they still phonograms, one for each syllable, or do they already function en bloc as a morphogram for the respective name? The status of these graphs as phonograms versus morphograms remained unsettled until the replacement, approximately in the 9th century, of full phonograms with simplified ones, as in the modern hiragana and katakana shown below. Even during and after this change, the toponym spellings remained unchanged. And in fact, they remain unchanged up to the present day in these cases, despite totally different looking hiragana and katakana you use. So here's another example, and also the final one in this section, again from Old Japanese. In Old Japanese, certain morphograms, such as this Chinese character used for writing the word kamo, meaning duck, were also phonographically used to write homophonous functional morphemes. In this case, the exclamatory particle combination kamo. They are typically classified as phonograms, which is, however, debatable. Disyllabic kamo, as in our example, is too specific in terms of pronunciation to spell any other morpheme or morphemes, string of morphemes than kamo. And therefore, the phonographic use in such cases is naturally confined to a single morpheme or a single string of morphemes. It is precisely due to the limited productivity of such phonograms that a reanalysis as morphograms suggests itself. In our example, this is further supported by the fact that the character is actually much more often used to render the exclamatory particle combination kamo than to write the word kamo for duck, at least as far as the corpus of old Japanese poetry is concerned. Now this concludes the three main sections of our talk, and Gordian will take over again for our conclusions for each of these sections.
So first, transitions from morphograms to phonograms and vice versa are well attested in the process of script transfer, but also within writing systems. So phonology is clearly not irrelevant to morphography or morphograms. The observations made in section 1 are difficult to reconcile with competing approaches. For instance, when a logogram is understood as a symbol denoting the meaning but not the pronunciation of a word or morpheme. We've also had a look at so-called heterograms and abbreviations. What these two cases have in common is that phonographic renderings omitting sounds, whether in consonantaries or in the case of alphabet-based abbreviations, function as morphograms on the level of knowledge. These can in turn be borrowed then into other writing systems as morphograms on the level of mapping. Second, our look at semantically motivated phonograms has shown that phonography is, despite its name, not necessarily purely related to the level of phonology. Instead, the polyvalence of graphs being used as both phonograms and morphograms on different occasions may lead to semantic illusions based on their morphographic usage. And should you know of any nice parallel cases in the writing systems you studies, then we would be very happy to learn about them. So please let us know. Third, we've seen that the typological status of graphs or strings of graphs is not always clear-cut. A solution taking into account the respective productivity of the phonograms involved seems possible at first, but is only really feasible for the two extremes. And these extremes are as follows. If a phonogram occurs in the spelling of one specific morpheme or string of morphemes only, an interpretation as a morphogram appears appropriate. And in a similar fashion, a phonogram that occurs in the spelling of any number of morphemes should be considered a phonogram for sure. However, for cases in between these two extremes, the situation is less clear, leaving us with a large number of indeterminable cases. And this concludes our talk. So thank you very much for your attention, and we would now like to open the discussion and gladly welcome any comments and questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I would like to advertise the talk by Frédéric Landragin, myself, and Kenichi Handa tomorrow, where we will see many examples of cases of gray areas of typological status and graphemic and graphetic methods of speculative fiction. So I have a first question by Daniel Kobayashi Better.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's my first time using Zoom, but thank you. Thank you for the really interesting talk. I've only got a small I'd like to confirm something that's more of an aside, rather than your main point in your talk. Could you just going back to heterograms that you were talking about in the very first part of your talk? Were those examples from a special text that have a reading tradition, for example, or is that an example of that readers would be able to just identify and read on first sight?
Yes, so these kind of heterograms, they are not very special kind of orthography you would only find in certain text, but it's a very common phenomenon you would generally find in any text, and they were presumably easy to read, yeah.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, that's it. Thank you very much.
Maybe tiny addition to that. So our example is from a Sogdian text, and generally, I mean, we are not experts in Sogdian or other Middle Iranian languages, but generally, Sogdian is usually said to be among the languages which feature relatively few of such morphograms in that sense. So these heterograms, and other Middle Iranian languages have much more per text. So it's especially for Sogdian, the inventory of such heterograms seems to be rather limited. So it's probably not much of a problem for readers at that time used to that sort of, yeah, employment of the writing system. Yeah. So it's not limited to this text, but a more general phenomenon.
I see. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating for me. Thank you.
And a comment by Dan Harbour.
You asked for other examples of writing systems that do this. The Sumerian cuneiform and the adoption into Akkadian comes to mind. So when I first came across the phenomenon, the slide you've got now, heterograms, I thought that it looked exactly like the later Akkadian use of what are called sumerograms in that literature. So that's one thing. On the other side, there's the very interesting handling of functional vocabulary within pure Sumerian, where, for instance, take the modal hu, it's originally written, it's subject to vowel harmony. And early on, one form is used to write it irrespective of its phonological form. So it's the morpheme, not the phonemic string. And then as time goes on, this gradually whittles away so that you get the first ha gets taken out and gets its own representation. And then I think it's he comes next. And so there's this, when I was going through it, I had exactly the sensation that you have in your talk, that it's just very difficult to take definitions of what's a phonogram, what's a morphogram, and get clear-cut analysis of what's going on in any particular word in certain writing systems.
Thank you very much. Just a brief comment, maybe question. Do you also have like semantically motivated phonograms in what you've seen in, yeah, let's say Akkadian or other cuneiform writing systems?
I definitely wouldn't know about Akkadian. And does anything jump out? Nothing jumps out, but you know, it's an area I'm familiar with, but I'm definitely
okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the comment.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your talk.